Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Getting right into it, we're tackling a big one today, the American Revolution.
And we're not just sticking to the surface stuff the textbook highlights, we're going deeper, unearthing the surprising factors that turned British colonists into revolutionaries. Think of it like this.
Okay, I'm listening.
You've got the dates and the battles down, sure.
Hmm.
But what were the underlying causes? The ideological debates, the social and economic tensions. That's where the real story lies.
It's like what they don't tell you in the textbooks is always the most interesting stuff, right?
Exactly. Take, for example, the fact that in the early 1760s, most colonists felt deeply connected to Britain. It wasn't some inevitable march toward independence.
Really, I feel like that's always how it's portrayed, though, like this unstoppable force.
Right. It's easy to look back and see it as a foregone conclusion, but the reality is much more nuanced, much more, well, human. The revolution wasn't some preordained outcome. It was the result of a series of choices and events, miscalculations even, that spiraled in unexpected directions.
Unintended consequences. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm intrigued. So if most colonists felt so connected to Britain, where did those cracks in the relationship even begin?
Well, the Seven Years' War is a good place to start. It left Britain with a massive debt and a strong desire to assert more control over its colonies. From the British perspective, the colonies existed to serve the empire. Simple as that.
Makes sense from a purely economic standpoint, I guess.
Exactly. Taxation, trade regulations, these were all seen as perfectly reasonable ways to manage their colonial possessions. But, and this is a big but, imagine being a colonist who had been running their own affairs for years.
Thanks to that whole salutary neglect thing, right?
Precisely. Salutary neglect meant that for much of the early 1700s, Britain was preoccupied with wars in Europe and paid less attention to the colonies. This hands-off approach allowed the colonies to develop their own political systems, their own economic interests, and crucially, a strong sense of self-reliance.
So it's like they were used to having a certain level of autonomy, I guess.
Exactly. And this wasn't just about practical matters either. Enlightenment ideas, especially those of John Locke, were really taking root in the colonies. His emphasis on reason and individual rights, the idea that government derives its power from the consent of the governed, well, this directly challenged the whole notion of absolute monarchy.
And if you're writing an APUSH essay about the ideological roots of the revolution, Locke is your guy. His writings were practically a how-to manual for questioning authority.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating how this intellectual shift coincided with a fervent religious revival known as the Great Awakening. While seemingly different, both movements empowered individuals to question established hierarchies.
It's like Locke provided the intellectual ammunition, and the Great Awakening provided that emotional fire.
Exactly. You've got these seemingly disparate threads, reason and religion converging to create a climate where challenging the status quo becomes, well, thinkable.
It's true, though. You can't underestimate the power of ideas, especially when they start to resonate with people's lived experiences.
Exactly. And let's not forget, the colonists considered themselves British. They read the same books, followed the same fashions. This wasn't about wanting a completely different culture.
More like, we love being British, but we also want the rights and freedoms that come with it. We're not cool with this whole being told what to do business.
Exactly. They wanted to reconcile their identity as British subjects with this growing sense of themselves as a distinct people. And that created a powder keg of tensions just waiting for a spark. And this is where that whole no taxation without representation thing comes into play, because for the colonists, it wasn't simply about disliking taxes. It was about
Principle, like who had the right to make decisions that directly affected their lives, right?
Exactly. See, the British argued that Parliament represented all British subjects, regardless of whether they actually voted in Parliament. This was the idea of virtual representation,
But the colonists were used to having their own elected assemblies, making decisions about their own affairs.
Precisely. So to them, this whole virtual representation thing felt like a bait and switch. And this is where I think the British really underestimated. Well, two things, really. The colonists' resolve, first of all.
Because they were not messing around.
Right. And second, their capacity for organized resistance. Take the Stamp Act of 1765, for example. It wasn't just a tax, it was a tax on practically every piece of paper colonists used. Newspapers, legal documents.
Even playing cards. Talk about an everyday annoyance.
Exactly. And the resistance wasn't just grumbling or complaining, it was organized and strategic, and it just kept getting more unified as time went on. You had, on the one hand, elite colonists like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson writing pamphlets, these fiery resolutions.
Does that stir things up?
Right. But you also had ordinary people taking to the streets, boycotting British goods, and even resorting to, well, let's just say persuasion tactics with groups like the Sons of Liberty.
Ah, yes, the Sons of Liberty. Those colonial troublemakers, I always picture them as like a bunch of guys in tri-corner hats meeting in secret taverns. Were they really that influential, or is that just like a romanticized version of history?
Oh, they were definitely a force to be reckoned with. They
Right.
tapped into this deep well of popular resentment, and they were not afraid to.
Hmm.
Well, let's just say they weren't afraid to get their hands dirty.
Or in the case of the Boston Tea Party, get their harbor full of tea.
Exactly. Their actions, while often on the edge of legality, let's say, demonstrated a willingness to challenge authority that really resonated with ordinary people.
And it wasn't just the Sons of Liberty either. Colonial women played a huge role in all of this too.
Absolutely. They organized those spinning bees to produce homespun cloth as a replacement for boycotted British textiles. And let's not forget about all the essays and letters they published in newspapers. These women were not afraid to express their political opinions.
It was like a massive decentralized protest movement. And this is where those committees of correspondence come into play, right?
Yeah.
They were like the 18th century version of social media.
Exactly. These committees, which were established by colonial legislatures, allowed colonies to communicate with each other, share information, coordinate their resistance efforts. They were really instrumental in fostering this sense of oneness, I guess, a shared purpose among colonies that were, geographically speaking at least, pretty far apart.
So you had this growing sense of colonial identity fueled by these shared grievances and facilitated by these new forms of communications. Like all of a sudden they're realizing, hey, we're all in this together.
Exactly. And that realization was super important because, newsflash, the British government wasn't backing down. In fact, they basically doubled down on their policies, which led to even greater resistance. The Townshend Acts of 1767, which imposed taxes on things like tea, glass, paper,
Everyday essentials.
Right. Well, those were met with a whole new wave of boycotts and protests.
But the British, instead of realizing that their policies were backfiring, they just kept pushing. Which ultimately leads us to one of the most infamous events of this whole period, the Boston Massacre.
Right. And while the details of what happened that night, was it a massacre? Was it self-defense? Those are still being debated even today, but...
It must have been something truly awful to be called a massacre at all.
Oh, absolutely. It was a turning point, for sure. The event was quickly seized upon by colonial propagandists like Paul Revere, for example, who used it to further inflame anti-British sentiment. Think about it.
I'm thinking.
His iconic engraving of the event, which, for the record, may not have been entirely accurate, depicted British soldiers firing on these unarmed colonists. It became a powerful symbol of British tyranny, regardless of what actually happened.
It's like a reminder that history is often shaped as much by perception as it is by facts, The Boston Massacre might not have been the bloodbath it was made out to be, but it created this whole narrative.
Yeah, that was hard to ignore.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then, of course, there's the Tea Act, which, and this is kind of ironic when you think about it,
Yeah.
made tea cheaper for the colonists.
Right. But it wasn't about the price of tea at all. It was about...
About principle again.
Exactly. It was about the principle of the thing. See, the Tea Act was seen as this sneaky way for Britain to get the colonists to acknowledge Parliament's right to tax them, even if it meant undercutting colonial merchants in the process.
And the colonists were not falling for it.
Yeah.
Enter the Boston Tea Party. It's such an iconic event, almost comical when you really think about it. What were the British thinking when they heard that a bunch of colonists dressed as Native Americans had dumped all that tea into the harbor?
Oh, they were furious. They saw it as a deliberate act of defiance, an attack on British property, an attack on British authority, and their response was swift and severe. The coercive acts, which the colonists called the intolerable acts, the whole point was to punish Massachusetts, try to isolate them from the other colonies, and hopefully, snuff out the rebellion before it could spread.
Because nothing says we want to reconcile, like shutting down a colony's main port and restricting their right to assemble.
Right. But much like almost every other British policy during this period, the coercive acts kind of had the opposite of their intended effect.
Yeah.
Instead of isolating Massachusetts, they actually ended up pushing the colonies closer together.
There's that whole united we stand thing, right?
Right.
Like once one of your own is under attack.
Exactly. And this is where we see the First Continental Congress taking on a whole new level of importance. What started as a meeting to discuss grievances, coordinate resistance, now they had to deal with the very real possibility of war.
So the stakes just got a whole lot higher. Were they ready for that kind of commitment?
Well, it was a divided Congress. You had radicals, guys like Patrick Henry, who famously declared, "Give me liberty or give me death." Those guys were ready to go.
Yeah, no messing around with Patrick Henry.
Yeah, exactly. But then there are others, especially in the South, who were a lot more cautious. They were worried about the economic consequences of independence, and they were especially concerned about what it might mean for slavery.
Ah, yes. The ever-present specter of slavery, casting a shadow over this whole thing. It's one of those uncomfortable truths that we can't really shy away from.
Yeah.
Here you have these colonists fighting for their own liberty while simultaneously denying it to others.
It's a huge contradiction, no doubt about it. And it's important to remember that even among those who opposed slavery, there wasn't necessarily agreement on how to deal with it. Some people favored gradual emancipation, a more slow, incremental approach.
Try to find some kind of compromise.
Right, exactly. While others were arguing for immediate abolition, no more waiting, no more excuses. So you've got these ideological battles playing out against the very real backdrop of a potential war. It was
the powder keg.
Totally. And while they're having these debates, events on the ground are escalating quickly. The battles of Lexington and Concord, April 1775, that marked the beginning of armed conflict.
The shot heard around the world, as they say.
Exactly. And once those shots were fired, there was no turning back. The Second Continental Congress, which met just a few weeks later, suddenly found itself in charge of managing a war that they hadn't necessarily chosen.
Talk about a baptism by fire.
Right. I mean, they authorized the creation of the Continental Army. They appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief. Huge decisions.
Yeah.
They made one last-ditch effort at peace with the Olive Branch Petition.
Hoping against hope.
Right, exactly. But by that point, King George III he was done playing nice. He declared the colonies an open rebellion, sent thousands of troops to try and put down the uprising.
And this is where that pamphlet, Common Sense, comes in.
Right.
The one that Thomas Paine wrote.
Oh, yeah. Common Sense. It's easy to overlook the importance of a pamphlet, but this was no ordinary pamphlet. Published in early 1776, it basically argued for independence. But it wasn't written in this highfalutin academic language. It was simple, direct, incredibly persuasive.
It was like the 18th century equivalent of going viral, right?
Exactly. Paine took these complex ideas about natural rights, government, and he made them accessible to the average colonist. And it had a huge impact on public opinion. All of a sudden, declaring independence didn't seem so radical because Paine was making the case that it was just common sense.
And then you've got individuals like Lord Dunmore, who really threw a wrench into things with his proclamation, offering freedom to enslaved people who joined the British side.
Right. I mean, talk about a power move. Dunmore's proclamation was absolutely a calculated move to exploit colonial divisions, try to bolster the British forces.
And maybe stir up some chaos along the way.
Probably. But like so many other things during this period, it ended up having unintended consequences.
Because those enslaved people who did fight for the British, they weren't necessarily fighting for Britain. They were fighting for their own freedom.
Exactly. It's a really important reminder that the revolution wasn't some black and white, good versus evil kind of story. It was way more complicated than that.
It was real life, full of tough choices and moral gray areas. Speaking of tough choices, eventually the Continental Congress had to make a decision. Were they going to declare independence or not? And we all know how that turned out.
Right. July 4th, 1776. It was a bold move, a gamble for sure. They were this brand new nation taking on the most powerful empire in the world. But
they believed in what they were fighting for, and they were willing to risk it all.
Absolutely. And that's something that I think gets lost sometimes in all the dates and battles and, dot names to remember. The American Revolution wasn't just about political or economic grievances. It was about ideas, beliefs.
Yeah.
It was about the very soul of a nation.
And it's a story that continues to resonate with us today, centuries later.
Absolutely. It reminds us that the past is never really past, The questions they were wrestling with back then about freedom, equality, the role of government, those are still relevant today more than ever.
Well said. So to our AP US history students listening out there, as you delve deeper into this period, remember, don't just memorize the facts. Think critically, question everything, and never underestimate those aha moments. That's where the real learning happens.
Well said. Couldn't agree more.
This has been another deep dive. Until next time, happy studying, everyone.